The morning sun cast a soft glow over the dusty town of Willow Creek. As the clock struck 8, Sarah stepped into the modest office of Jacob Foster, the town's wealthiest landowner, her heart pounding with both anxiety and hope. This was the first time she had ever met him in daylight, and she wasn't sure what to expect. What she did know was that her future, and the future of her children, depended on this meeting. Jacob Foster was everything Sarah had imagined a rancher to be. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt with a black silk vest. His hair was neatly combed back, and his well-groomed beard added to his authoritative presence. But it was his eyes that captured Sarah's attention. Brown and deep, filled with a sadness so heavy that she could almost feel it herself. The weight of a man who had lost more than he could bear. "Good morning, Mr. Foster," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt. "You wanted to see me?" "Good morning, Sarah," Jacob replied, his deep voice calm yet laced with a controlled pain. "Please, have a seat." Sarah hesitated for a moment, the chair before him seeming too intimate a space for someone like her. But he had asked, and she wasn't one to refuse. She sat, straight-backed, her gaze unwavering, and waited for him to speak. Jacob settled into his own chair, his eyes never leaving Sarah. She was different in the light, stronger, more dignified than he had first imagined. She was a beautiful woman, that much was clear. But it was more than just her appearance that intrigued him. There was a resilience about her, a sense of justice that came through even in her posture. "I've heard a bit about your situation," Jacob began, his voice measured. "You were forced off your farm, I understand?" Sarah nodded, not flinching as she spoke. "Yes, I was. And I had no choice but to leave." Her voice remained firm, though her heart clenched as she recalled the pain of losing the only home she had ever known. It was because of the way Mr. Jenkins was treating the workers on his land. He was exploiting them, paying them barely enough to survive, and charging outrageous prices for food and shelter. In the end, they were left in debt, worse off than when they started. It was like modern-day slavery. Jacob leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he listened intently. "You confronted him about this?" "I did," Sarah replied. "I told the workers the truth, and I made sure they knew what was going on. Jenkins didn't take kindly to that. He fired me without a second thought." A heavy silence settled over the room as Jacob absorbed her words. It wasn't just the injustice that angered him. It was the realization that he had unknowingly played a part in it. He had bought the land that Sarah's family had once farmed, land that Jenkins had taken over 5 years ago. Back then, he hadn't asked questions. He had trusted Jenkins's word that the families living on the land had been compensated and moved to better places. But now, as he looked at Sarah, a pang of guilt struck him. She had lost everything in that transaction, her family's livelihood erased in one fell swoop. And to make matters worse, Sarah's father had been one of those displaced families. Jacob closed his eyes briefly. Pain etched on his face. "I had no idea," he murmured. "I didn't know that families were affected like that. I trusted Jenkins. I should have checked." He opened his eyes and met Sarah's gaze. "I failed you, and I failed those people. I'm sorry." Sarah felt her chest tighten. The man in front of her wasn't a cold-hearted businessman as she had expected. He was remorseful, even if his apology couldn't undo the damage. "It wasn't just you," she said, her voice softer now. "Jenkins did this, not you. But you were a part of it, and that's something I can't ignore." Jacob nodded, acknowledging her words. "You're right. I should have cared. I was too busy expanding my own empire to see the bigger picture." His voice faltered as he added, "I've learned a hard lesson." The room fell quiet once more as Sarah considered his words. She couldn't change the past, and she wasn't here to seek revenge. But something about Jacob's sincerity made her hesitate. She had spent years fighting to survive, to protect her children. But now, in this room, She saw a man who was not so different from herself. He was broken too, and perhaps that was why he understood the weight of her struggle. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice steady again. "I didn't come here seeking charity. I'm not asking for your pity." Jacob's eyes flickered with something between regret and resolve. "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's justice. It's the least I can do." He stood up then, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "I want to offer you and your children a place to stay, here, at Santa Cruz. You can stay as long as you need, without any conditions, without any expectations. Just a roof over your heads, food on the table." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't want to appear too eager. "And what do you want in return?" she asked, still cautious. "Nothing," Jacob replied, his voice softer now. "If your conscience doesn't allow you to accept without doing something in return, you can help around the house. My housekeeper, Rosa, is getting on in years. She could use the help." Sarah studied him carefully, looking for any signs of hidden motives, but there were none. All she saw was a man trying to make amends. "I'll stay," she said after a pause, "but only until I can get back on my feet. I won't be dependent on anyone's kindness." Jacob nodded in understanding. "I respect that, and if you decide to stay longer, you won't owe me anything. It's just a safe place for you and your children, and I promise I'll make sure no one will take advantage of you here." As Sarah left Jacob's office, she felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't experienced in years. There was a chance, a real chance, for a new beginning. And perhaps, just perhaps, the life she had lost could be rebuilt, not just for her, but for her children too. Willow Creek was no longer a place of despair. It had become a place of possibility. And with each step she took toward the future, Sarah knew she was closer to finding the peace she so desperately sought. The days that followed were unlike any Sarah had ever known. The heavy weight of the past few years seemed to lift, if only a little, with each passing hour she spent at Santa Cruz. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of stability, something that had long eluded her. But as much as she appreciated the safety Jacob offered, she couldn't ignore the nagging doubts that still clung to her heart. Could she truly trust him? Was this really a chance at redemption for both of them? Or just another part of the system that had failed her family? Jacob Foster had kept his word. The rooms in the main house, once cold and sterile, now seemed alive with possibility. Sarah and her children, Peter, Anna, and little João, settled into their new lives with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She spent her days helping Rosa, the elderly housekeeper, tending to the household chores and learning more about how things worked in the house. It was nothing glamorous, but it felt right. For the first time in a long while, Sarah wasn't consumed by the anxiety of survival. There was food on the table every day, and the kids, after years of hardship, were finally starting to laugh again. But Sarah knew this peace was fragile. She couldn't forget the bitterness of the past, nor the fact that Jacob, despite his sincere apology, was still a man who had benefited from the very system that had destroyed her father's life. Her father had been one of the displaced families when Jacob's land had been sold, and his dream of working the land he'd loved had been shattered. She still remembered how it felt, watching her father's health deteriorate after they lost their farm, and how he had passed away soon after, broken both physically and emotionally. She hadn't even had the chance to mourn him properly, too caught up in the struggle for survival. Yet, in the quiet moments, as she watched her children play in the garden or heard their laughter echo through the halls of the grand house, Sarah couldn't deny the peace that was slowly seeping into her soul. Peter had taken to the stables with an enthusiasm that Sarah hadn't seen in him since his father's death. The horses, especially Trovão, the prized stallion of Santa Cruz, seemed to accept Peter in a way they had never accepted anyone else. Sarah found herself amazed at how quickly he adapted, learning the ins and outs of caring for the horses under the watchful eye of Jacinto, the stableman. Anna, on the other hand, had found a sanctuary in the library, where she devoured every book she could find. Her curiosity, a trait she shared with Sarah's late mother, seemed endless. There was no shortage of material to feed her mind. The house had an extensive collection of books, most of which had been untouched for years. Jacob, surprisingly, welcomed Anna's interest, even offering to help her with any words she didn't understand. Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of gratitude toward him, for encouraging Anna's love of reading, something her mother had cherished deeply. Little João, despite his tender age, had quickly formed a bond with Rosa, the elderly housekeeper. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched them together. João, always the playful one, found comfort in Rosa's nurturing ways, and Rosa, in turn, seemed to come alive in his presence. The transformation in both of them was undeniable. For the first time in ages, the house was filled with warmth, both literal and emotional. But with this newfound peace came the constant undercurrent of fear. The fear that Jacob, no matter how sincere in his remorse, might revert back to his old ways. The fear that something or someone would come to disturb the fragile balance they had built. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the specter of her father's loss would always haunt her, whether she could truly accept Jacob's actions as part of his journey toward redemption. And then, one fateful day, the past came crashing back in a way neither Sarah nor Jacob had anticipated. It was a bright, sunny morning when the sound of hooves against the dirt road outside broke the peaceful silence of Santa Cruz. Sarah was in the garden, gathering herbs for dinner, when she looked up and saw the familiar, unwelcome sight of August Jenkins, Jacob's former business partner, riding toward the estate with his typical arrogance. Her heart sank as she watched him dismount from his horse. His broad, corpulent frame and polished appearance made it impossible to mistake him for anyone else. Jenkins had always carried himself like a man who believed he was untouchable, and nothing had changed. As he strutted toward the house, Sarah felt a chill run through her, remembering the man who had kicked her father off the land he had worked for so many years. "Mr. Jenkins," Jacob greeted coldly, stepping out onto the porch. Sarah could see the tension in Jacob's posture, the way his jaw clenched as he faced his former partner. "Ah, Foster," Jenkins sneered, his smile dripping with condescension. "I've heard the rumors, you know, about you harboring that worker's widow and her children. Is it true? Is this what you've come to? Defending a woman who's nothing but trouble?" Sarah, unable to stay silent any longer, stepped forward. "She's not a troublemaker. She's a woman who stood up for what's right," Sarah shot back, her voice sharp and full of conviction. "And you know exactly what you did to my family." Jenkins looked at her with a cruel smile, sizing her up. "Ah, so you're the one who's been making a fuss. Tell me, did you really think this would end well for you, girl? You're nothing but a washed-up widow with 3 hungry mouths to feed." Sarah's blood boiled, but before she could speak again, Jacob intervened, stepping between them. "Enough," Jacob said firmly, his voice low but filled with authority. "You don't come onto my property and speak to my guests like that, Jenkins. Not anymore. You're done here." Jenkins's smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "I see you've grown soft, Foster. Just remember, this is the last time I warn you." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his horse, leaving the estate in a cloud of dust. As he rode away, Sarah felt a sense of both relief and unease. The confrontation with Jenkins had been inevitable, but it had brought more to light than she'd expected. Jacob had stood up for them, in a way that was not just out of guilt, but from a genuine desire to make things right. He had protected her, and in doing so, had given her something invaluable, a sense of security and a glimmer of hope for the future. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Jacob as he stood next to her. watching Jenkins disappear into the horizon. He gave her a somber smile. "You don't have to thank me," Jacob replied. "I'm the one who owes you an apology, not the other way around." And with that, something shifted between them. There was no going back to the way things had been before. The past was still there, heavy with memories of loss and betrayal. But the future? The future was something they would build together, step by step. And for the first time in years, Sarah could finally see a future worth fighting for. The days that followed brought unexpected changes. Jacob's resolve to make things right extended beyond mere words. He set into motion plans to investigate Jenkins's actions, determined to hold him accountable for the exploitation that had so long plagued the town. It was a long process, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of hope as she saw Jacob's sincerity unfold before her. And for the first time, Sarah realized that forgiveness wasn't just for the person who had wronged her. It was a gift she had to give herself, to let go of the past, to heal, and to open herself up to the possibility of a new life, one where love, trust, and justice could coexist. As the weeks passed at Santa Cruz, Sarah found herself slowly adjusting to the rhythms of life in the grand house. The isolation that had once defined her existence, the weight of grief and loss, began to lift, replaced by the quiet comfort of stability. Her children, Peter, Anna, and little João, had each found their own place within the estate, thriving in ways Sarah had never imagined. The fears and doubts that had once consumed her thoughts, questioning whether this new life was truly a fresh start or simply another chapter of suffering, began to fade. Peter, despite his initial hesitance, had discovered a deep connection with the horses. The stables, where the prized stallion Trovão stood, became his sanctuary. Under the guidance of Jacinto, the old stableman, Peter learned the ins and outs of horsemanship. His natural talent for working with animals had become apparent to everyone, especially Jacinto, who saw the potential in the boy. Peter's once somber demeanor had lightened, replaced by the joy of early mornings spent with the horses. His passion for caring for them, for understanding their needs, had given him purpose. Sarah had never seen him smile so often, and it filled her heart with warmth. Anna, too, had flourished in this new environment. The large, dusty library had become her second home. She devoured books with the kind of passion only a curious mind could understand. Her days were filled with stories of adventure, history, and the world beyond Willow Creek. Sarah watched as Anna's intelligence and thirst for knowledge grew every day. Anna had even begun to assist in organizing the library, creating a lending system so that the workers' families could enjoy the treasures hidden among the shelves. It was a modest gesture, but it meant the world to Sarah to see her daughter take such ownership of her newfound world. Little João, always full of energy and curiosity, had become particularly attached to Rosa, the elderly housekeeper. Rosa, who had once been a stranger to Sarah, now seemed like a second mother to João. The two spent hours together, with Rosa telling João stories from the past and teaching him the simple joys of life. How to fold sheets, how to set the table, and how to care for the garden. Rosa's warm, loving presence had brought an unexpected lightness to the house, and that João was thriving under her care. While her children flourished, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The weight of the past still loomed large in her heart. She had come to Santa Cruz seeking refuge, but as the days wore on, she was forced to confront a troubling truth. Could she ever forgive Jacob for his role in the loss of her father's land? No matter how kind he had been to her and her children, no matter how many times he apologized, Sarah couldn't forget the fact that his business dealings had been part of the reason her family had lost everything. Could she forgive him for that? Was it possible to rebuild her life here, under his roof, without the shadow of that betrayal hanging over her? Jacob, too, wrestled with his own demons. While he had done everything in his power to make amends for his past mistakes, he couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him daily. The loss of his wife and child had shattered him, and for years He had buried himself in work, unable to confront the emotional wreckage that was left behind. But in Sarah, in her children, he saw a chance to right his wrongs, a chance to build something new, a family, a future. Yet, despite his good intentions, he feared that the weight of his past actions would always hang over them, that Sarah would never fully trust him, that she would never see him as anything more than the man who had indirectly destroyed her family. One afternoon, as Sarah worked in the garden, tending to the flowers that had begun to bloom in the warm spring air, the sound of hooves on the dirt road caught her attention. She looked up, her heart sinking as she saw the familiar figure of August Jenkins, Jacob's former business partner, riding toward the estate. Jenkins had always been a man who carried himself with an air of superiority, and his presence on the estate brought back memories Sarah wasn't ready to relive. Jacob, sensing the tension in the air, stepped outside to greet Jenkins, his expression hardening as the two men exchanged pleasantries. Sarah, unable to resist, stepped out from behind the garden wall to confront the man who had played a role in her father's demise. The conversation was tense, filled with accusations and subtle threats. Jenkins, ever the arrogant businessman, spoke with disdain, insulting Sarah and her children. But Jacob, standing beside her, did something Sarah hadn't expected. He stood up for them. With quiet authority, he told Jenkins that he was no longer welcome on the estate, that his dealings were no longer of any concern to him. As Jenkins left, muttering curses under his breath, Sarah felt a mix of emotions flood her chest. On the one hand, she was relieved that Jacob had defended her, that he had finally taken a stand against the man who had played such a significant role in her family's suffering. But on the other hand, a part of her remained conflicted. Could she trust Jacob? Could she truly forgive him for his past actions? The days that followed the confrontation with Jenkins brought unexpected change. Jacob's actions had shown Sarah that he was committed to making things right, that he was willing to confront the demons of his past in order to build something better. And for the first time since arriving at Santa Cruz, Sarah began to allow herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the fresh start she had been longing for. Jacob, too, had taken steps to right the wrongs of the past. He had begun investigating Jenkins's exploitative practices, determined to expose the man for what he truly was. And when Sarah learned that Jacob was using his influence to gather evidence of Jenkins' crimes, she felt a flicker of hope. It was as if, little by little, the man who had once been her enemy was becoming someone she could trust. It was a long and difficult journey, but with each passing day, Sarah found herself growing stronger. The past, while still painful, no longer had the power to control her. She had learned to forgive, not just Jacob, but herself. And as she watched her children thrive in their new home, Sarah realized that they had all been given a second chance, a chance to build a future free from the mistakes of the past. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Sarah and Jacob continued to navigate the complex landscape of their relationship, finding new ways to trust, to forgive, and to love. For the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to dream of a future together, a future that was no longer defined by loss, but by hope. And in that hope, they found the strength to keep moving forward, side by side. The days following Sarah's decision to stay at Santa Cruz were filled with quiet transformations. The weight of her grief, though still present, was no longer an unbearable burden. Her children, Peter, Anna, and João, had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of their new life. They found their places within the walls of the grand house, in the garden, the stables, and the library. Each day, Sarah witnessed their growth, their curiosity, their resilience. They were no longer simply survivors of their circumstances. They were thriving, becoming part of something larger than themselves. Peter's connection with the horses deepened with every passing day. He had quickly become Jacinto's most trusted pupil. The bond he shared with Trovão, the majestic stallion, was undeniable. It was as though the horse had recognized something in Peter. Something pure, something determined. And in return, Peter found a sense of purpose he had never known before. Jacinto, the old stableman, often watched the boy work with the horses, his gruff exterior softening as he saw the boy's natural talent and steady hands. Peter had found something that filled the emptiness he had carried since the death of his father. The horses became his refuge, a place where he could be himself, far removed from the hurt that had defined so much of his life. Anna, too, had flourished. She spent hours in the library, reading the books that had once seemed so out of reach. The library, with its rows of ancient leather-bound volumes, became her sanctuary. She pored over tales of adventure, history, and faraway lands. She began to organize the books, creating a lending system that allowed the workers' families to share in the wealth of knowledge. Sarah watched her daughter, once shy and unsure of herself, now take ownership of something so precious. Anna's thirst for knowledge had blossomed, and with it, a confidence that seemed to grow with each new discovery. Little João had become inseparable from Rosa, the elderly housekeeper. Rosa, who had once been a stranger, had become a surrogate mother to João. The two of them spent their days together. Rosa teaching João how to fold linens, how to tend to the garden, and how to carry himself with dignity. There was something in the way João looked at Rosa that spoke volumes. He needed her, and Rosa, in turn, had found a purpose in caring for him, just as she had for Jacob when he was a child. The bond between them was something that Sarah could not have anticipated, but she was grateful for it. For Sarah, however, the road to healing was not as straightforward. Her feelings toward Jacob were still conflicted. He had been kind, generous even, but he was also the man who had once been involved in the very transaction that had led to the loss of her family's land. His apology, though sincere, could not erase the deep hurt she had felt when her father's land was taken from them. Could she truly forgive him? Could she move past the man who had indirectly caused her family so much pain? Jacob, too, struggled with his own feelings of guilt. The death of his wife, Clara, and his son, Miguel, had left him broken. For years he had buried himself in work, avoiding his emotions, avoiding confronting the emptiness inside. But when Sarah and her children arrived at Santa Cruz, something inside him began to shift. He saw in Sarah a woman who had known loss in a way that mirrored his own. He saw in her children the same joy, the same light, that he had once seen in his own son. Jacob began to wonder if perhaps his time in the dark was over. Could he start anew, with Sarah and her children, as they forged a new life together? One afternoon, as Sarah was working in the garden, tending to the flowers that had begun to bloom, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves on the dirt path leading to the estate. Her heart sank as she looked up and saw the familiar figure of August Jenkins, Jacob's former business partner, riding toward the estate. Jenkins was a man Sarah had always mistrusted. He had played a significant role in the dealings that had led to her family's downfall, and his presence on the estate brought back memories that she wasn't ready to relive. Jacob, sensing the tension in the air, stepped outside to greet Jenkins, his face hardening as the two men exchanged pleasantries. Sarah, unable to stand by and watch, stepped forward, confronting Jenkins in the way she always did, with strength and dignity. The conversation was tense, filled with thinly veiled threats and accusations. Jenkins, ever the arrogant businessman, looked down on Sarah with contempt. But Jacob, standing beside her, did something unexpected. He stood up to Jenkins. With quiet authority, Jacob told Jenkins that he was no longer welcome on the estate, that his dealings no longer had a place in their world. Sarah watched in stunned silence as Jacob, the man who had once been so passive, stood his ground and defended her and her children. It was a small victory, but for Sarah, it meant everything. She realized that Jacob was no longer the man who had caused her family's pain. He was trying to be someone different, someone she could trust. And in the days that followed, Sarah's internal struggle deepened. She saw the change in Jacob, but could she trust it? Could she trust him? She began to notice the small ways in which he was working to make amends, not just with her, but with the people around him. He had started to look into the affairs of Jenkins and had taken steps to expose the man's corrupt practices. For the first time, Sarah saw Jacob for what he truly was, a man who had made mistakes, but was now doing everything in his power to make things right. The tension between them began to ease, and Sarah found herself allowing him into her world, slowly but surely. Jacob was no longer just the man who had wronged her. He was a man who was willing to change, to fight for what was right. And in that change, Sarah began to see a glimmer of hope for the future. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't as impossible as she had once believed. Perhaps, just perhaps, this new life at Santa Cruz could be the beginning of something beautiful. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and Jacob began to grow closer. Their shared grief, their shared desire for redemption, brought them together in ways they hadn't expected. Sarah no longer saw Jacob as the man who had ruined her family's life. Instead, she saw him as a man who had the potential to be something more. A man who, like her, was trying to heal. And as the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden light over the fields of Santa Cruz, Sarah realized that she had found something she had long since given up hope of ever having again. A sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting the past, but the kind that came from accepting it, and from knowing that it was possible to start anew. In time, Sarah would learn to forgive. She would learn to let go of the anger and resentment that had weighed so heavily on her heart. And with Jacob by her side, she would begin to build a new life, not just for herself, but for her children, for the future that awaited them all. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the legacy of Santa Cruz would no longer be defined by loss and regret. It would be defined by resilience, by the strength of a family that had been torn apart and had found its way back together, and by the love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. And so, the story of Sarah and Jacob, of forgiveness and second chances, would continue, written in the quiet moments of everyday life, in the laughter of children and the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. The beginning of something new had been set into motion, and though the path ahead was uncertain, Sarah knew one thing for sure. They were no longer living in the shadows of the past. They were living for the future. The days after the incident with August Jenkins marked a significant shift in Sarah's perspective. The weight of her decision to stay at Santa Cruz had begun to lift, but the complexities of her emotions still lingered. Her children, Peter, Anna, and João, were adjusting to their new lives with remarkable resilience. It was as though the arrival at Santa Cruz had awakened something in each of them. Some of Peter, the most reserved of the three, continued to develop his bond with the horses. Under Jacinto's patient tutelage, he became increasingly skilled. Trovão, the once temperamental stallion, had taken a particular liking to Peter. There was a quiet understanding between them, a mutual respect that transcended words. Peter found comfort in the stables, his days spent grooming and caring for the horses. For the first time in years, the weight of his grief seemed to lessen, replaced by a newfound purpose. Jacinto, who had seen countless men try and fail to tame the wildness of the horses, was quietly impressed. He knew that Peter had a natural gift, a connection to the animals that he had never seen before. Anna, on the other hand, found solace in the library. The endless shelves of books, each one filled with stories of faraway lands and adventures, captivated her imagination. Sarah watched her daughter with a sense of awe. Anna, once a shy and uncertain girl, was now an avid reader, a young woman who had discovered a passion for knowledge. She had taken it upon herself to organize the library, creating a system that allowed the workers and their families to borrow books. The knowledge that had once been out of reach for people like her was now available to them, and Anna reveled in the idea of sharing it. She had begun teaching the younger children to read, passing on the skills her mother had taught her, and for the first time, Anna felt as though she was truly contributing. João, ever the playful one, had grown close to Rosa, the elderly housekeeper. Rosa had been a mother figure to Jacob in his youth, and now, in her later years, she had found herself nurturing João in the same way. He followed Rosa around the house, helping her with small tasks and sitting at her feet as she told him stories of the past. Rosa had a unique way of seeing the world, and João absorbed her tales with wide-eyed wonder. Sarah noticed the bond between them, and it warmed her heart. The boy, who had once been so fearful and lost, had found comfort in Rosa's presence. She had become his rock, and in return, João filled a gap in Rosa's life that she hadn't realized was missing. As for Sarah, her healing had begun, but it was not without its challenges. There were moments when the pain of her past threatened to resurface. The land her father had lost, the betrayal of Jacob's involvement in that loss, and the crushing weight of grief that had consumed her for so long. They all came rushing back in waves. But Sarah was no longer alone. Her children, with their innocence and joy, had a way of pulling her back from the brink. They were her reason to keep going, her reason to build a future. And, perhaps more unexpectedly, Jacob had become part of that future. The man who had once been so distant, so consumed by his own pain, had shown a side of himself that Sarah had not expected. His efforts to right the wrongs of the past were sincere. Jacob had not only defended her when Jenkins had come to Santa Cruz, but he had also begun investigating Jenkins' corrupt dealings. Sarah had never seen this side of him before. It was as if, in his grief over the loss of his wife and son, he had been blind to the world around him. But now, with Sarah and her children in his life, Jacob was beginning to see, to understand the weight of his own actions. He had made mistakes, yes, but he was determined to make amends. And Sarah, though still cautious, had begun to see that this man, once so self-absorbed, had the capacity for real change. One evening, as the sun set over Santa Cruz, Sarah sat with Jacob in the garden, their children playing nearby. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers, and the soft sound of children's laughter filled the space between them. Jacob turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low, "about the land, about everything that happened with your family." Sarah stiffened, but she didn't interrupt. She had learned over the past few months that Jacob's self-reflection was not just empty words. It was genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he continued. "I should have done more. I should have investigated what Jenkins was doing. I should have cared about the people who were affected by it. But I didn't. And I can't undo that. But I'm trying. I want to help. I want to fix what I can." Sarah met his gaze, her heart heavy with the weight of his apology. Could she forgive him? Could she truly let go of the anger that had held her captive for so long? "I appreciate your words, Jacob," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "But it's not just about words. It's about actions. And right now, I need to see those actions. I need to see that you're committed to making things right, not just for me, but for everyone who has been affected by your decisions." Jacob nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "You'll see. I promise." As the days passed, Jacob kept his word. He continued to investigate Jenkins and uncovered a mountain of evidence that proved the man's exploitation of workers and fraudulent practices. Jacob hired the best lawyers in São Paulo, sending letters to trusted contacts, and soon the press began to pick up on the scandal. Jenkins' once solid reputation crumbled, and the man was arrested for his crimes. For Sarah, It was a moment of bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. But there was one final step that Jacob took that truly moved Sarah. He used his wealth and influence to purchase the land that had once belonged to her family. The land that had been sold to Jenkins all those years ago. When he handed Sarah the deed to the land, she was overcome with emotion. It was not just a piece of land. It was a symbol of justice, of closure, and of a future that they could now build together. "I can't change the past," Jacob said quietly, "but I can help you rebuild." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, took the deed. "Thank you," she whispered. But Jacob wasn't finished. He turned to her, his voice more earnest than ever. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want to be part of your future, Sarah. I want to build that future with you. And if you'll have me, I'll do everything I can to make things right." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. The path ahead was still uncertain. But in that moment, she realized that she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, the weight of the past didn't seem as heavy as it once had. "Yes," she said softly, her heart filled with a new sense of hope. "Let's build that future together." And so the story of Sarah and Jacob, of redemption and second chances, continued. They were no longer bound by the past. Instead, they were forging a new future, one step at a time. Together, they were healing. Not just for themselves, but for the family they had built. A family that had found its way back to love, to hope, and to each other. The days following the conclusion of Jenkins's arrest were a whirlwind of change. Santa Cruz, once a place burdened by silence and regret, was slowly transforming. With the weight of the past lifting, Sarah, Jacob, and their children began to rebuild not only the estate, but their lives. The work was far from easy, and it was not without its challenges. Yet, there was a palpable sense of renewal, a sense that despite all that had been lost, something beautiful was now emerging from the ashes. Peter, now fully immersed in his work with the horses, had found a true purpose. The bond he shared with Trovo, the stallion that had once been feared by many, had deepened. The once wild horse now trusted Peter implicitly, and the two of them spent hours in the stables together, as Peter learned the intricacies of caring for the animals. Under Jacinto's watchful eye, Peter's confidence grew. Jacinto, who had worked with horses for most of his life, could see the unique connection Peter had with the animals. He had a natural gift, one that Jacinto had not often seen in others. But it wasn't just about the horses anymore. Peter was becoming more confident in his own skin. He no longer carried the burden of guilt and fear that had once held him back. Santa Cruz had given him a chance to heal, and he was taking it, one step at a time. Anna, on the other hand, had become a beacon of light for the rest of the family. Her natural curiosity had led her to the library, and she had taken it upon herself to organize the books and create a catalog system. What began as a personal project soon evolved into something much larger. Anna began teaching the workers' children to read, creating a small community of young learners. Sarah marveled at the transformation in her daughter. Anna had always been quiet and reserved, but now she exuded a confidence that Sarah had never seen before. Anna was no longer just Sarah's daughter. She was a teacher, a mentor, and a vital part of the community that was slowly taking shape at Santa Cruz. Through her love of books, she had brought new life to the farm, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her. João, ever the mischievous one, had found his place with Rosa. The old housekeeper, who had long cared for Jacob when he was a child, had found new purpose in caring for João. The two of them had developed a special bond, one that was rooted in love and affection. Rosa had been the mother figure in Jacob's life after his own mother had passed. And now she was providing that same comfort to João. He followed Rosa around the house, helping her with whatever task she could find for him to do, all the while soaking in her stories of the past. It was a simple, yet profound relationship, one that was healing in its own way. João had once been a boy lost in grief and fear, but now he was growing, learning, and finding his place in the world. Rosa, in turn, had rediscovered her purpose, and the two of them brought light to Santa Cruz in ways that no one could have predicted. As for Sarah, the healing had been a slower process. She had made peace with the loss of her father's land and the betrayal that had come with it. The guilt and anger that had once consumed her now seemed distant, though the memories still lingered. What had once been an unbearable weight was now something she could carry, even if only just. Jacob, too, had changed. The man who had once been so wrapped up in his own grief was now a man trying to make things right. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the land would be returned to those who had been wronged. And he had begun to repair the relationships that had been damaged over the years. It wasn't just about making amends. It was about building a life that was worthy of the future they were creating together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob and Sarah sat together on the porch. The evening air was cool, and the faint sounds of the children's laughter could be heard in the distance. For the first time in what seemed like forever, there was peace in the air. Jacob turned to Sarah, his eyes softening as he spoke. "You've changed me, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if I ever really understood what it meant to live before you and the kids came into my life. I was lost, but you brought me back. I'm not the same man I was before." Sarah looked at him, her heart heavy with emotion. She had seen the changes in Jacob, and she had come to understand that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about accepting the present, flaws and all. "You've done the work, Jacob," she replied quietly. "You've shown me that you're not just talking about change. You're living it. And that's all I can ask for." The days that followed were filled with small victories. Jacob continued his efforts to make amends for the past, working with lawyers and contacts in São Paulo to ensure that justice was served for those who had been wronged. He was determined to make things right, not just for Sarah, but for the entire community that had been affected by his previous decisions. He poured his energy into uncovering every detail of Jenkins's fraudulent practices and ensuring that those responsible would face consequences. The process was long and tedious, but Jacob's resolve never wavered. He knew that, in the end, it would be worth it. The victory over Jenkins was only the beginning. The true victory would come when Santa Cruz became a place of healing and hope for all who sought it. One morning, Jacob walked into the kitchen, his face lighting up when he saw Sarah and the children sitting together. The warmth of the room, the laughter that filled the air. It was everything he had ever wanted. It was everything he had lost, and now, everything he had regained. He knew, in that moment, that the journey he had started years ago was far from over. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, his voice steady. Sarah looked at him, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "About what?" "About the future," Jacob replied. "About us. About this farm. I want to keep building. I want to keep making things right for all of us. But most of all, I want to make sure that we're creating something lasting. Something that our children can be proud of." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She had never expected this life. But now, sitting here with her children, her heart was full of hope for the future. "I think we can do that," she said softly. "Together." And so, the journey continued. Santa Cruz was no longer just a piece of land. It was a symbol of redemption, of second chances, and of the power of family. Each day brought new challenges, but also new beginnings. Jacob, Sarah, and their children had found something that couldn't be taken away. Love, hope, and the promise of a future built on the lessons of the past. As the days turned into months, and the months into years, Santa Cruz transformed from a place of pain to a place of prosperity. The community flourished, and the family found themselves growing not just in numbers, but in strength and unity. They had overcome the darkest of times, and in doing so, they had built something more beautiful than they could have ever imagined. Their story, like the land they had reclaimed, was just beginning, and they were ready to face whatever came next, together. As the days passed, the transformation of Santa Cruz became undeniable. What had once been a home weighed down by regret and silence had blossomed into a lively sanctuary, one where healing and growth were not just aspirations, but tangible realities. Jacob, Sarah, and their children, who had endured so much, found themselves at the heart of this revival, shaping it with their hands and hearts. The estate was no longer merely land to be managed. It was a place of belonging, a testament to the strength of the family, and a beacon of hope for the community that had long struggled in the shadows. Jacob, who had once been consumed by his guilt and the weight of his past mistakes, now worked tirelessly to rectify the wrongs he had once allowed to happen. The legal battles with Jenkins had not been easy, but they had brought a sense of purpose to his life. The process of exposing Jenkins's corrupt practices had been slow, but every small victory felt like a step closer to redemption. Jacob knew that it wasn't enough to simply settle the past. He had to ensure that the future would be one of fairness and justice. With every document he uncovered, every testimony he gathered, Jacob felt the burden lifting. It was as though each act of justice was a stitch in the fabric of his own redemption. Meanwhile, Sarah had become a pillar not only for her family, but for the entire community. The bond she shared with her children deepened as they all grew into their roles within the farm. Sarah was no longer just the woman who had endured loss. She had become a symbol of resilience and strength. Her relationship with Jacob had evolved as well. No longer was she simply his partner in survival. She had become his equal, his sounding board, his strength in the darkest moments. Together, they had started to heal, not just for themselves, but for the legacy they wished to build. Peter, once a boy weighed down by the trauma of his past, had found his calling in the stables. His bond with Trouvon had blossomed into something extraordinary. No longer the wild, untamable stallion, Trouvon had become a reflection of Peter's own growth. As Peter worked alongside Jacinto, the old stableman, he gained not only skills, but confidence. Jacinto had seen the potential in Peter from the beginning. And now, seeing how the boy handled the horses with calm authority, Jacinto could not help but feel a sense of pride. Peter had become a leader in his own right, respected by the workers and admired by his peers. And yet, despite his newfound strength, Peter remained humble, always remembering the hardships that had shaped him into the man he was becoming. Anna, too, had flourished. Her curiosity and intelligence had blossomed in the confines of Santa Cruz's library. Once shy and reserved, she had become a teacher, a guide for the children of the workers who had come to see her as a source of knowledge. The library, once a forgotten corner of the house, had become her domain. She had organized the books, creating a system for lending and teaching, and had even begun tutoring the younger children in basic literacy. Anna's transformation was not just about her intellect. It was about her understanding of the power of knowledge. She had taken it upon herself to teach the others not only to read, but to dream of a future they had never imagined. Her passion for learning had become infectious, and the children in the community began to look up to her as someone who could show them a way forward. João, too, had found his place, and it was in the simplest, yet most profound way. His bond with Rosa had only deepened since the arrival of the family at Santa Cruz. Rosa, the once forlorn governess who had spent so many years caring for the memory of Jacob's mother and his lost youth, had become João's steadfast companion. The two of them spent their days together, whether it was helping in the garden, tending to the animals, or simply sharing stories. For Rosa, João represented a healing she hadn't known she needed. In many ways, He had brought her back to life, just as the family had brought new energy to Santa Cruz. Juan, in return, had found a safe haven in Rosa's nurturing care, a constant in his life that had once been consumed by the uncertainties of his childhood. He was now the happy child he had once been, full of laughter and joy with a bright future ahead of him. As the months went by, the entire family began to live in ways they hadn't in years. The old, empty halls of Santa Cruz, which had once echoed with sorrow, were now filled with the sounds of life, laughter, learning, and the hum of activity. Jacob and Sarah had not only transformed the estate, but had also transformed their marriage. They were no longer a couple weighed down by secrets and guilt. They had become partners in every sense of the word. Partners in love, in business, in family, and in the future they were building together. But even as Santa Cruz flourished, a sense of unease remained, hanging like a shadow over everything they had worked for. The past, though no longer all-consuming, still lingered, and the specter of Jenkins was never far from Jacob's mind. Despite his efforts to dismantle Jenkins's empire of corruption, Jacob knew that the scars left by the man's actions would not heal quickly. The community, though supportive, still carried the weight of years of exploitation. Jacob had done everything he could to ensure that Jenkins faced justice, but he knew that true change would take time. And it would come not just from the law, but from the people's hearts. One evening, as Jacob sat at his desk reviewing the final papers in Jenkins' case, Sarah entered the room. She was silent for a moment before speaking. "You've done everything you can, Jacob," she said gently. "Now it's time to focus on us, on what we've built together." Jacob looked up at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to smile. "I know, but I can't help but feel there's more to do." Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "We've come so far already. Look around you, Jacob. Look at the children, the farm. This is ours. This is our new beginning. We've already created something beautiful. The future is ours to shape." Her words were a balm to his weary soul. He nodded slowly, realizing that she was right. He had been so focused on fixing the past that he had nearly forgotten to live in the present, to embrace the future they had fought for. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Jacob and Sarah stood together, looking out over the land they had reclaimed. It wasn't just the land that had been transformed, it was their lives. The future was no longer a distant hope. It was here, in the lives they were building, in the love that had flourished between them, and in the family that had grown not just by blood, but by choice. Jacob turned to Sarah, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for showing me how to live again." Sarah smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "We saved each other, Jacob, and we'll keep saving each other. Together." And together, they stepped forward into a future filled with promise, a future where the past would never define them, but their love and the legacy they created would. Santa Cruz was no longer just a place on a map. It was home, and it was theirs. As the sun rose over Santa Cruz, the once silent farm seemed to breathe a new life. The rhythmic hum of daily chores, the laughter of children echoing through the halls, and the rustling of the wind through the trees all signaled the beginning of a new era. Jacob and Sarah, having reclaimed not just the estate, but also their own identities, stood together as equals, no longer haunted by the ghosts of their past. Their journey, though far from complete, had transformed them, bringing them closer together and building a foundation of trust, love, and shared purpose. Jacob, still a man burdened by his past actions but determined to atone, had finally begun to see the fruits of his efforts. The legal battles with Jenkins had been grueling, but the evidence he had gathered, thanks to the meticulous work of Sarah and their family, was beginning to make waves. Jenkins, once untouchable in his web of corruption, was now on the defensive. Jacob had become more than just a man seeking justice for his mistakes. He had become a symbol of integrity in a world that had been so often defined by exploitation. The workers of Santa Cruz, once unsure of their future, now looked to Jacob with a newfound respect. His actions were speaking louder than his words ever could. But it was Sarah who had emerged as the true heart of the estate. Her resilience, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of people had shaped not only her children, but also the very spirit of Santa Cruz. She had never been one to shy away from hard work. And it was through her dedication that the house, the land, and the community had begun to heal. The transformation was not just physical. There was a quiet peace in the air, a sense of purpose that Sarah had brought to the farm. She had woven a tapestry of trust and unity among the workers, ensuring that each person felt valued and heard. Peter, now a young man, stood as a living testament to that peace. His bond with the horses had deepened, and his skill in caring for them had become legendary. He had spent countless hours alongside Jacinto, learning the ways of the horses, gaining knowledge of their needs, and cultivating a deep respect for the animals that had once seemed so intimidating. The relationship between Peter and Trovan, the once untamable stallion, had blossomed into something almost spiritual. It was as if the horse, too, had recognized the growth in Peter, accepting him not only as a caretaker, but as a friend. Jacob, who had watched Peter grow from a boy with no clear direction into a young man with purpose, found himself filled with pride. Peter had found his place in the world, not just through hard work, but through passion and dedication. Anna, on the other hand, had become a force of her own. The once shy girl who had been hesitant to speak up was now a teacher, a mentor, and an inspiration to those around her. Her love for reading, sparked by the discovery of the vast library at Santa Cruz, had ignited a flame in her that had spread throughout the entire farm. Anna had organized reading groups for the children of the workers, and soon enough, the entire community had begun to recognize the power of education. She had even started tutoring some of the older workers who had never learned to read, teaching them not only how to read, but how to think critically, to question, and to dream of a better future. Anna's growth had mirrored the transformation of the estate itself. Both had blossomed, shedding their old layers of hardship and becoming something entirely new. For João, the youngest, life had become a whirlwind of love and attention. His bond with Rosa had deepened as she had become his constant companion, guiding him through the small moments of his childhood. Rosa had found in João a healing she hadn't known she needed. And in return, João had found in her the maternal love he had been deprived of. Their days were filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of joy that only children and those who cared for them could experience. João, with his boundless curiosity and infectious smile, had become the light of Santa Cruz, always bringing joy to those around him. His innocence and unwavering trust in the world had a way of reminding everyone of the beauty in simplicity. As the family continued to flourish, Jacob and Sarah's relationship deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. They had both come to Santa Cruz with broken hearts and fractured lives, but over time, they had become something stronger than mere partners. They had become equals, companions, and ultimately, friends. Their bond, though still new and fragile, had been tempered by the fire of their shared experiences. Jacob, once isolated in his guilt, had found a partner who saw him not as a man defined by his past, but as a man capable of redemption. Sarah, who had once been defined by her losses, had found in Jacob someone who saw her strength and resilience. Together, they had created a home filled with love, understanding, and hope. However, as with all journeys, their path was not without obstacles. Though Jenkins had been brought to justice, and the workers of Santa Cruz had begun to feel a sense of security, the shadows of their past still lingered. There were days when Jacob would look out over the land, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost. And he would wonder if the past would ever fully release its grip on him. There were nights when Sarah, in the quiet moments before sleep, would find herself questioning if they had truly done enough, if they had done all they could for the people they had promised to protect. Yet, despite the lingering doubts, there was an undeniable shift that had taken place, both within themselves and within Santa Cruz. What had once been a house of sorrow had become a home of joy. What had once been a farm of despair had become a place of hope. The land, though scarred by years of exploitation, had begun to heal, just as the family had. And as the days passed, the promise of a brighter future seemed less like a distant dream and more like an inevitable reality. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Jacob looked around at the faces of his children, at Sarah, at the workers who had become family. He could hardly believe how far they had come. The journey had been long, fraught with pain, mistakes, and moments of doubt. But in the end, it was the love they shared, the love that had built their home, that had made all the difference. "Here's to us," Jacob said, raising his glass, "to second chances, to redemption, and to the family we've created." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "To the future," she added softly. And in that moment, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because, as they had learned, the true power of redemption wasn't in erasing the past, but in building something new, something better, from the ashes. Life is never without challenges, but it is in these difficulties that we truly discover our own strength. Just like the story of Jacob and Sarah. As they entered a new life with hearts weighed down by pain and regret, yet found each other and rekindled hope, this story is not just about correcting mistakes, but also about learning to forgive, to love, and to live fully with what we have. Each day is an opportunity to renew ourselves and change our lives. No matter how dark the past may be, as long as we have the courage and perseverance, the future will always offer wonderful opportunities. Remember, life is not about seeking perfection, but about learning to love and cherish the moments we have. Whether small or grand, every decision, every action, no matter how small, can change your life and the lives of those around you. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to leave your comment and share your feelings with us. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on other inspiring stories. Thank you for joining us on this journey.